This painting by Hieronymus Bosch is called the Hooiwagen, and it's based on popular imagery that discusses some things having to do with the journey through life and where how you go through life. It A lot of these paintings that we're looking at are actually in Spain because they were taken out of the Netherlands and put in El Escorial by the king, actually at the time of Velázquez, which is in the mid 1600s. So this painting, even though it's Netherlandish, you'd have to go actually to Spain to see a lot of really great Netherlandish paintings. And the painting, what we think is, it's almost like a religious journey, but it's also a bit like a Last Judgment in some ways, with more genre kinds of imagery and a lot of submerged imagery and symbolism. In the left-hand panel, we have basically paradise, and paradise is where Adam and Eve are. And so it's got some really strange imagery in it. And again, I guess we should start at the top and then work our way down because that's kind of how the narrative is running, left to right and top to bottom. And so we have God in heaven, and it's God the Father who is sort of reigning over things. And these legions of weird insect-like creatures are flying around the clouds above him. And I have not been able to really kind of figure out what that means. Maybe it's a sort of hallucinatory view of what angels look like or who they are. Move down the picture and you see God the Father who's wearing the Pope's tiara, which is the Pope's crown, interestingly enough. And he is pulling Eve out of Adam's side, which is the creation of Eve, and making Eve out of Adam's rib. Then we move down the picture just a little bit more, and there's this serpent who is offering up the apple from the tree of knowledge, and ultimately leads to them at the very bottom of the scene being thrown out of paradise by the archangel Michael, who is ushering them out and swinging a sword at them to get going. We move into the central panel, and it's probably meant to be in some ways a representation of our world and where we are now. So if we start thinking about it a little bit more and we zoom in a little bit more on some of the details, what you'll see first of all is you have this Hooiwagen, and a Hooiwagen is just a wagon. And it could be a reference to some celebrations that kind of happen during planting and harvesting seasons. And this would be particularly a harvesting season kind of thing. You have God in the sky above watching over everything, and his rays of light are happening. And you have these sort of obscure, weird symbols that are in a bush that are behind these people who are atop the Hooiwagen. And probably the interpretation of this, a reasonable interpretation, would be that there was a proverb and a bunch of sayings about the Hooiwagen of life, and if you live it up now, you'll surely suffer in hell later, kind of thing. And so there are these lovers who are sitting atop this Hooiwagen, who are a hay wagon, going for a hay ride. They're sort of making love, they're playing music, they're having a totally great time. And above them are these weird kinds of symbols. For instance, there's some sort of staff or lance with a vessel hanging off of it, and I don't know if that's a reference to the holy vessel, and I don't know how that would work. But then you have an owl, and owls are actually symbols of death. And for instance, if you look at Michelangelo's tomb for the Medici, you'll see that there's actually an owl nestled against the genitals of one of the figures, which you could go into a Freudian interpretation of that, but owls often represent death and night. You move down the painting, and what you see are a whole bunch of people who are sort of yucking it up and living it up and having a good time. And they are sort of oblivious to what's going to happen to them in the far right-hand scene if they don't get right with Jesus, if they don't get right with God. And we have these sort of surreal things. Some people are being run over by the hay wagon. And then as we move down, we actually have some real life things that represent people who are being kind of damned and doing some really bad things. And so, for instance, we've got this guy in the center who they're dueling, and one guy's cutting another guy's throat. Then we have what looks like it could be the sale of indulgences in the very center, because there's this sort of a little kiosk or a table with a bunch of people who have a Sacred Heart above them. And in the far right corner, you have this guy who looks like a friar, and he's super fat, which could be a representation of gluttony. Now remember, this is all could be's. But I think that these are reasonable interpretations. And when I studied this with Herbert Broderick at Lehman College, and then even with another doctor of music history, Bruce Lamott at University High School, when I was teaching there, he kind of suggested that these paintings were meant to be sort of conversation pieces, that you would sit and you would drink wine and you would look at these things and you would sort of contemplate your own mortality in life. So this is where all of this gluttony and all of this high living leads us, is the far right panel. And what we have is this sort of horrific view of hell and all of the tortures that befall us in hell if we don't lead a righteous life. So we've got this burning sky, we've got people who are looting the castles, we've got people who are being dragged along, and I suppose maybe even the idea of sexual diseases like syphilis and kind of things, because there are actually figures who have frogs on their genitals and things like that, which could be about warts and the kinds of buboses and things like that that happen from sort of immoral and open sexuality. And then we move down the scene, we see these people in a moat who are being tortured by demons. So in a way, what you have is a schema of the Last Judgment that we saw, for instance, in Michelangelo's Last Judgment and Gisli Berdis's and things like that. And it's a symmetrical composition that lays out a sort of narrative left to right, but it definitely is meant to make you think about your existence and the kinds of